poor black nurse took the job nobody wanted at cruel Millionaire's house and lived the best day of her life. The eviction notice trembled in Keisha Washington's hands like a dying leaf, the red lettering blurring as tears she refused to shed gathered in her eyes. 27 years old, and she was about to lose everything again. The cramped apartment she'd fought so hard to keep after her grandmother's death, the small space where Nana's voice still echoed in every corner, telling her she was smart enough to heal the world. Now it would become another memory, another place she'd been forced to leave behind. Before we continue with this story, tell me where you are watching from and make you subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Keisha smoothed her worn scrubs and checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, and her natural hair, usually her pride, was pulled back in a tired ponytail. She'd worked 3 double shifts this week at the community clinic, but it still wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough anymore. The rent was due in 5 days. The clinic had cut her hours again, and her nursing degree, the one she'd worked 2 jobs to afford, felt worthless in a job market that seemed determined to undervalue everything she had to offer. Her phone buzzed with another automated message from a debt collector, and she silenced it without looking. "God, Nana," she whispered to the empty room. "I don't know how much more I can take." The memory of her grandmother's weathered hands came back to her, how they'd been steady and sure even when the cancer was winning. "Baby girl," she'd said in those final days, "sometimes the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when it doesn't feel like a blessing." Keisha had stopped believing in blessings months ago. Underscore 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 underscore. 15 miles across town, Vincent Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard where he'd already won every game. At 52, he'd built an empire that stretched across 3 states, but the view from the top had grown cold and colorless over the years. His reflection in the glass showed a man who'd forgotten how to smile genuinely. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide the fact that he rarely ate anymore, ice blue eyes that had learned to calculate worth in dollars rather than measure it in humanity. He'd become exactly what the world expected: ruthless, successful, and utterly alone. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Ashford," the agency called again. "They're having trouble filling the position." Vincent's jaw tightened. "What's the problem now?" "It's the 15th nurse this month, sir. She lasted 3 days before. Well, before she quit without notice." He turned from the window, his gaze falling on the medical equipment in the corner, reminders of the weakness he despised, the vulnerability he'd sworn never to show again. "They're all the same. Soft. Unprofessional. Find someone with actual backbone." But even as he spoke, Vincent knew the truth. It wasn't the nurses who were the problem. It was him. The man who'd once believed in second chances had become someone who gave none, who tested every person who entered his space until they broke or fled. He'd perfected the art of pushing people away before they could choose to leave on their own. The disease was progressing faster than his doctors had predicted. Soon, he'd need more than just someone to monitor his medication and check his vitals. He'd need someone who wouldn't flinch when he fell apart, who wouldn't pity him when the man who'd conquered everything finally succumbed to the one thing money couldn't defeat. His phone showed 17 missed calls from his sister, but he couldn't bear to hear her voice crack with worry again. She'd stopped visiting after the last incident, when he'd been particularly cruel about her choice to marry for love instead of status. Now she lived 3 states away with her teacher husband and their children he'd never met, probably telling them cautionary tales about their uncle who'd chosen money over family. "Sir," his assistant's voice came through the intercom again. "The agency says they have one more candidate. Someone desperate enough to take the position despite their reputation." Vincent's laugh was bitter. Desperate. Perfect. At least desperation breeds commitment. He had no idea that desperation could also breed courage, or that sometimes the person who needs a job the most is the one most willing to fight for dignity in the face of cruelty. He had no idea that by tomorrow, a woman named Keisha Washington would walk into his sterile world and change everything he thought he knew about strength, grace, and the true meaning of wealth. The stage was set for a collision between two souls who'd learned to protect themselves in vastly different ways. One through quiet dignity, the other through calculated cruelty. Neither could imagine that their meeting would become the catalyst for transformation neither knew they desperately needed. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to discover later that your first impression missed something crucial about who they really were? The employment agency smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Keisha sat in the waiting room, her hands folded in her lap, watching the receptionist avoid eye contact for the third time in 10 minutes. The other applicants, all white, all looking like they'd stepped out of medical magazine spreads, whispered among themselves about the impossible position. "I heard he made the last nurse cry," one murmured. "Screamed at her for breathing too loudly. My friend's cousin lasted 6 hours," another added. "Said he was absolutely cruel. Inhuman." Keisha's stomach nodded, but she stayed silent. She couldn't afford to be picky about inhuman. Her grandmother had cleaned houses for families who treated her like furniture, and she'd taught Keisha that dignity wasn't something others could take away. It was something you chose to keep. When they called her name, the receptionist's expression was almost apologetic. "Mrs. Washington, Mr. Ashford will see you now." The penthouse elevator rose so smoothly she barely felt the motion, but her heart hammered against her ribs. The doors opened to reveal an apartment that belonged in magazines. All white marble and pristine surfaces, like a museum where nothing had ever been truly lived in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of medical equipment that looked expensive enough to fund a small clinic. Vincent Ashford stood with his back to her, silhouetted against massive windows that framed the city like a conquered kingdom. When he turned, his ice-blue eyes swept over her with the kind of calculating assessment she'd grown used to. The look that reduced her to a collection of assumptions and stereotypes. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice carrying the kind of cultured authority that came from never being questioned. "And what did you expect, Mr. Ashford?" Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe, that she'd met his gaze directly instead of looking away. Someone different. The pause before different hung heavy between them, loaded with implications they both understood. Keisha felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same flame that had gotten her through nursing school while working midnight shifts, through her grandmother's illness, through every moment when the world tried to tell her she didn't belong. "I'm a registered nurse with 5 years of experience in geriatric care and chronic illness management," she said, her voice steady despite the way he was studying her like a specimen. "I graduated summa cum laude from nursing school while working 2 jobs to pay for it. I've held the hands of dying patients and celebrated with those who defied odds. I've cleaned up every kind of mess the human body can produce and never once complained about the work." She took a breath, then continued. "But if you're looking for someone who'll let you treat them like garbage because you have money, then you're right. I'm not what you expected." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Vincent's face was unreadable, but something dangerous glittered in his eyes. For a moment, Keisha wondered if she'd just talked herself out of the only job that could save her apartment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, not the warm expression she'd hoped for, but something sharp and predatory. "Perfect. You're hired." "I what?" "You start tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." He turned back to the window, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten people had feelings. "My assistant will give you the details." Keisha stood frozen, uncertain whether she'd just been thrown a lifeline or pushed into deeper water. "Mr. Ashford, I think we should discuss expectations. The only expectation that matters is that you do your job and stay out of my way." His voice had gone cold, clinical. "I don't need conversation. I don't need compassion. I need someone competent enough to manage my medical needs without bothering me with the tedious details of human interaction. The words hit her like slaps, each one designed to reduce her to nothing more than a service provider. But as she looked at his rigid posture against the window, Keisha saw something else. The careful way he held himself, the almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand, the medical equipment that wasn't just for show. Vincent Ashford wasn't just cruel. He was afraid. "I'll be here at 7, she said quietly. "And Mr. Ashford? Despite what you might think, I'm not easily intimidated. I've dealt with difficult patients before." He didn't turn around, but she saw his reflection in the glass. The way his jaw tightened, the flash of something that might have been respect or might have been annoyance. "We'll see about that, Mrs. Washington." As she left the penthouse, Keisha's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of standing her ground. She'd taken jobs before where she'd had to swallow her pride, but something about Vincent Ashford's calculated cruelty sparked a defiance she hadn't felt in months. The elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying her back to a world where she'd have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, where her worth was measured in hours worked rather than lives touched. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something besides desperation. She felt ready to fight. Tomorrow, she would walk into Vincent Ashford's pristine prison and discover that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with words or weapons, but with the simple, radical act of refusing to let someone else's pain justify cruelty. She would learn that strength wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about choosing to remain human even when humanity seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. The job nobody wanted was about to become the beginning of everything she'd never dared to hope for. Keisha arrived at 6:55 a.m., her scrubs pressed and her expression set in the kind of professional calm that had gotten her through the worst shifts at the clinic. The doorman barely looked up as he directed her to the service elevator, a small humiliation that Vincent had probably orchestrated, reminding her from the first moment that she was staff, not a guest. The penthouse felt different in the morning light, less like a showroom and more like a mausoleum. Vincent sat at a massive dining table that could seat 12, eating breakfast alone while reading financial reports on a tablet. He didn't look up when she entered. "You're early," he said without lifting his eyes from the screen. "I suppose that's something. I believe in punctuality." Keisha set her bag down carefully, taking in the medical chart that had been left for her. Pages of prescriptions, test results, and doctor's notes that painted a picture of a man whose body was betraying him in ways his money couldn't fix. "Your medication schedule is quite complex," she observed, professional compassion creeping into her voice despite herself. "Are you experiencing any side effects I should know about?" Vincent's head snapped up, his blue eyes flashing with something between anger and panic. "I don't need your pity, Mrs. Washington. I need you to follow the schedule and keep your observations to yourself." "I wasn't offering pity. I was doing my job. Your job is to hand me pills and check boxes on a chart. Nothing more." The harshness in his voice would have made most people step back, but Keisha had spent years in understaffed clinics where fear and pain made people lash out at anyone within reach. She'd learned to see past the words to the wound beneath. "Mr. Ashford, I understand you value your privacy, but if I'm going to provide proper care..." "Proper care." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "You want to know what proper care looks like? It looks like doing what you're told without trying to psychoanalyze every interaction. It looks like remembering that you're here because you need money, not because you're some kind of savior." The words were designed to cut, to remind her of her place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. But instead of shrinking back, Keisha felt something spark inside her. The same fire that had helped her grandmother face terminal illness with grace. The same strength that had carried her through nursing school when professors doubted her abilities. "You're right," she said calmly. "I do need this job. But that doesn't mean I'll let you talk to me like I'm less than human." Vincent's face went very still. "Excuse me? I said I won't let you talk to me like I'm less than human. I'll follow your medical schedule. I'll respect your privacy. I'll do everything in my power to help you manage your condition. But I won't stand here and let you use your pain as an excuse to be cruel." For a moment, something flickered across Vincent's expression, shock, perhaps, or recognition. Then the mask slammed back into place, harder than before. "My pain." His voice was deadly quiet. "You think you understand anything about my pain? I understand that you're scared. I understand that losing control of your body feels like losing control of everything. I understand that it's easier to push people away than to risk letting them see you vulnerable. You understand nothing." The words came out like broken glass. "You walk in here with your amateur psychology and your assumption that underneath it all, I'm just a wounded soul waiting to be healed by your compassion. But some people aren't broken, Mrs. Washington. Some people are just cruel." He moved closer, using his height and presence to intimidate her. "I've fired people for less than what you've said to me in the past 10 minutes. I could have you blacklisted from every medical facility in the city. I could make sure you never work as a nurse again." Keisha's heart hammered, but she held her ground. "You could do all of that, but you won't. And why is that? Because despite everything you've said, you hired me. Not because I was desperate, though I am. Not because I was the only one left, though I might be. You hired me because something in you recognized that I wouldn't break. And deep down, you don't want someone who'll break. You want someone who'll stay." The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too dangerous to speak aloud. Finally, he stepped back. "You're delusional if you think I want anyone to stay. Maybe. But I'm still going to do my job." "Fine." He turned away, but not before she caught a glimpse of something raw in his eyes. "Your first task is to organize the medication cabinet. The combination is 8-2-7-3. Don't touch anything else." As he walked toward what she assumed was his office, Keisha felt the weight of what had just happened. She'd drawn a line in the sand, and somehow he'd chosen not to cross it. But she could feel the tension crackling between them, the sense that they were both circling something neither was ready to name. The morning stretched ahead of them, full of careful distances and unspoken challenges. Vincent had retreated to his office, and Keisha busied herself with the medical supplies, but both of them were hyper-aware of the other's presence. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm when the pressure builds and builds until something has to give. Neither of them realized that resistance was just another form of connection, that the energy they were using to push each other away was the same energy that would eventually pull them together. The first crisis came at 2:47 p.m., when Vincent's carefully controlled world began to fracture. Keisha had been organizing his medical supplies when she heard the sound, a crash from the office, followed by silence that felt more ominous than any scream. She found him on the floor behind his desk, his face pale and his left hand pressed against his chest, the expensive crystal paperweight that had been on his desk scattered in pieces around him. "Don't," he gasped when she rushed toward him. "Don't touch me." But Keisha was already kneeling beside him, her training overriding his protests. "Mr. Ashford, I need to check your pulse. This could be related to your medication." "I said don't." His words cut off as another wave of pain hit him, his body betraying his desire to maintain control even in crisis. "I'm going to help you to the couch," she said firmly, slipping her arm around his shoulders. "And then I'm going to take your vitals. You can be angry about it later." He was heavier than she'd expected, his expensive suit unable to hide the way illness had begun to hollow him out. But there was still strength in him, still the proud bearing of a man who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. As she helped him to the leather couch, she felt him trembling, not from weakness, but from rage at his own vulnerability. "This is exactly what I didn't want," he said through gritted teeth once she'd settled him down. "I don't need your heroics." "It's not heroics. It's basic medical care." Keisha was already checking his pulse, her fingers gentle but professional against his wrist. "Your heart rate is elevated, but not dangerously so. When did you last eat?" "I don't remember." "Mr. Ashford, your blood sugar could be." "Stop." His voice was raw, desperate. Just stop pretending to care. The words hung between them like a challenge. Keisha could have chosen the safe response, the professional distance that would let them both pretend this moment hadn't happened. Instead, she met his eyes directly. I'm not pretending. Something shifted in Vincent's expression, surprise, maybe, or fear. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're in pain, and not just physical pain. I know you're scared of depending on someone else. I know you think pushing people away will protect you from being hurt again. She paused, then added quietly, I know because I've been there. You've been where? His voice had lost its sharp edge, becoming almost curious despite himself. Afraid to let anyone close enough to matter. Afraid that if I needed someone, they'd leave anyway. Keisha continued monitoring his pulse, but her voice grew softer. I lost my grandmother 6 months ago. She was the only family I had left, and watching her die, it made me want to build walls so high that nothing could touch me again. Vincent stared at her, and for a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped. But you didn't. Build walls. I tried. But walls don't keep out the pain, they just keep out the healing. Before he could respond, the power went out. The sudden darkness was complete, the penthouse's electronic systems failing with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo through the silence. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the medical equipment look like something from a horror movie. The backup generator should kick in, Vincent said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. It always kicks in. They waited. The silence stretched. The generator remained silent. My oxygen concentrator, Vincent said suddenly, his voice tight with panic. If the power doesn't come back. Keisha was already moving, checking the battery levels on the portable units, calculating how long they'd last. The backup oxygen should give us 4 hours, maybe 5 if we're careful. But we need to call the repair service. The phones are down too. Everything runs through the building's main system. They were trapped together in the growing darkness, the comfortable distance Vincent had maintained suddenly impossible. The medical emergency had forced them into physical proximity, and now the power failure was forcing them into emotional proximity as well. I need to monitor your breathing, Keisha said, settling into a chair beside the couch. The stress could affect your condition. You don't have to stay here. The emergency lighting will last through the night. I'm not leaving you alone when your oxygen is limited. This isn't your problem. Yes, it is. Her voice was firm, final. You hired me to provide medical care, and that's what I'm going to do. Vincent fell silent, and in the red-tinted darkness, Keisha could see him struggling with something deeper than physical discomfort. He was a man who'd built his life on control, on the ability to manage every variable and eliminate every risk. But illness had taken that control away, and now circumstances were forcing him to depend on someone else in ways he'd sworn never to allow again. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Do what? Need someone. The honesty in his voice was devastating in its simplicity. Here was a man who'd conquered industries and commanded respect, reduced to the fundamental human truth that everyone, no matter how powerful, eventually needs help. You don't have to know how, Keisha said gently. You just have to let it happen. Outside, the city glittered with power they didn't have, but inside the darkened penthouse, something more important than electricity was beginning to flow between them. The power remained out as evening settled over the city, transforming Vincent's penthouse into a strange cocoon of red emergency lighting and hushed conversations. They'd moved to the living area, where the medical equipment cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence between them had grown comfortable rather than tense. Vincent sat propped against the couch cushions, his breathing steady but labored, while Keisha monitored his vitals with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to find calm in crisis. The proximity that had seemed so impossible that morning now felt natural, necessary. Tell me about your grandmother, Vincent said suddenly, his voice cutting through the soft hum of the oxygen concentrator. Keisha looked up from the medical chart she'd been updating by flashlight. Why? Because I want to understand why you're not afraid of me. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications neither of them had been ready to address in daylight. In the red-tinged darkness, truth felt safer somehow, as if the emergency lighting had suspended the normal rules of their careful dance around each other. Her name was Dorothy, Keisha said finally. Dorothy Mae Washington. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. She was a housekeeper for families who barely saw her as human, but she never let their treatment break her spirit. She paused, remembering weathered hands that had been gentle despite decades of hard work. She used to tell me, "Baby girl, hurt people, but healed people heal people. You choose which one you want to be." And you chose healing. I chose to try, even when people made it difficult. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his oxygen mask. My wife used to say something similar. Before she died, the words came out like a confession, and Keisha felt her breath catch. In all the agency briefings and whispered warnings about Vincent Ashford's cruelty, no one had mentioned a wife. What happened to her? Cancer. 3 years ago. His voice was barely above a whisper. She was 34. We'd been married for 6 years, and she was the only person who ever made me want to be better than I was. The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered, and Keisha felt her professional composure crack slightly. I'm sorry. She died in a room not unlike this one, surrounded by the best medical equipment money could buy, attended by the most skilled doctors, receiving treatments that cost more than most people make in a year. And none of it mattered. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. All that power, all that money, and I couldn't save the one person who actually mattered. Is that why you're so angry? Because you couldn't control what happened to her? I'm angry because I promised her I'd live. Really live, not just survive. And instead, I've spent 3 years building walls so high that no one can get close enough to hurt me again. Keisha set down her pen, giving him her full attention. What was her name? Catherine. Everyone called her Cat. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. She was a pediatric nurse at the children's hospital. She used to say that rich people were just scared people with better insurance. She sounds wise. She was. She's also the reason I never had children. She wanted them desperately, but the cancer, it took away her ability to have them before it took away everything else. The confession hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate sorrows into something shared. Keisha understood now why Vincent had been so hostile to her compassion. Every kindness must have felt like a reminder of what he'd lost. After she died, Vincent continued, I fired everyone who'd been close to us. Our housekeeper, who'd worked for us for 4 years. The gardener who'd helped Catherine with her rose garden. Even my assistant, who'd sent flowers to the funeral. I couldn't stand the pity in their eyes, the way they looked at me like I was broken. But you were broken. There's no shame in that. Kat would have hated what I became. She would have been horrified by the way I've treated people, the way I've treated you. He met her eyes directly. Why didn't you quit? After this morning, after the way I spoke to you. Keisha considered the question carefully. Because I recognized the pain underneath the anger. And because my grandmother taught me that running away from difficult people usually means running away from people who need help the most. I don't deserve your compassion. Maybe not. But I'm not giving it to you because you deserve it. I'm giving it to you because I choose to. Vincent stared at her, and in the red emergency lighting, she could see him struggling with something deeper than gratitude. The nurses who quit, they weren't wrong about me. I was cruel. Deliberately cruel. I made them feel small because it was easier than admitting I was the one who felt small. But you're not being cruel now. Because you won't let me be. You see right through it. He paused, then added quietly. Kat would have liked you. She would have said you have a strong heart. I wish I could have met her. She would have told you to run. She would have said I'm too damaged to risk caring about. Good thing I don't always take advice. For the first time since she'd met him, Vincent laughed. Not the bitter sound she'd heard before, but something genuine and warm. No, I suppose you don't. The laughter faded, but something had shifted between them. The walls Vincent had built so carefully were starting to crack, and through the gaps, Keisha could see glimpses of the man Catherine had fallen in love with. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you understood was carrying a burden you never could have imagined? The power returned at 3:17 a.m. with a gentle hum that seemed to sigh through the penthouse, restoring the artificial daylight that made everything seem both normal and strangely hollow after their hours in the red-tinged darkness. But instead of the harsh fluorescent glare Vincent usually maintained, only the soft lamp by the couch remained on, creating a warm pool of light that neither of them seemed eager to leave. Keisha had dozed fitfully in the chair beside him, her professional instincts keeping her alert to any changes in his breathing. When she stirred, she found Vincent watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You stayed," he said simply. "I told you I would. People tell me a lot of things. They don't usually mean them." She stretched, working out the kinks in her neck from sleeping in the chair. "I'm not most people." "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not." Something had changed between them during the long night. The crisis had stripped away the careful defenses they'd both maintained, leaving them in that strange, vulnerable space where honesty became possible. Vincent no longer seemed like the cruel employer from the morning, and Keisha no longer felt like just his employee. "I should make breakfast," she said, starting to rise. "Keisha." The sound of her first name in his voice stopped her. "Thank you. For staying. For everything." The simple words hit her with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had thanked her for just being herself? At the clinic, her care was expected, routine. Here, somehow, it felt like a gift freely given and gratefully received. "You're welcome, Vincent." His name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for the professional distance she'd tried to maintain. But professional distance seemed impossible now, after sharing confessions in the darkness and watching him struggle with vulnerability. "I haven't had breakfast with another person in 3 years," he admitted as she moved toward the kitchen. "I'm not sure I remember how to make conversation. We've been making conversation all night." That was different. That was survival. Maybe all good conversation is about survival, in one way or another. The kitchen was a study in expensive emptiness, granite countertops that looked like they'd never been used, a refrigerator that hummed with barely contained emptiness. But Keisha found eggs, bread, and coffee, the basics of sustenance that could transform a sterile space into something approaching home. "When did you last cook for someone?" she asked, noticing how Vincent hovered uncertainly in the doorway. "Kat used to make breakfast on Sundays. After she got sick, I couldn't bear to eat in the kitchen anymore. Too many memories. Good memories, though? The best." His voice was soft with reminiscence. "She'd make these elaborate pancakes shaped like animals for the children we never had. Said it was practice for someday. Even when the chemo made it hard for her to stand, she'd insist on making Sunday breakfast." Keisha cracked eggs into a bowl, her movements sure and economical. "My grandmother used to make biscuits from scratch every Sunday after church. I never learned how. I was always too busy with schoolwork or jobs. I regret that now. What would you ask her if you could? How she stayed so strong. How she managed to keep believing in goodness when the world gave her so many reasons not to." Keisha glanced at him. "What about you? What would you ask Kat?" Vincent was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, I'd ask her to forgive me. For becoming someone she wouldn't recognize. I think she already has. You don't know that." "No, but I know that people who love us don't stop loving us just because we lose our way. They wait for us to find our way back." The eggs sizzled in the pan, filling the silence with something homey and normal. Vincent moved closer, not quite helping but not quite hovering, as if he were relearning how to exist in a space where someone else was taking care of him. "I used to cook," he said suddenly. "Before the money, before everything became about proving I was worth more than my father thought. I made Kat dinner on our first date, burned the chicken, undercooked the vegetables, nearly gave us both food poisoning. But she stayed. She laughed until she cried, then ordered pizza and told me it was the most romantic disaster she'd ever experienced." His smile was genuine now, unguarded. That's when I knew I loved her. Not because she was impressed by what I could buy her, but because she found joy in my failures. Keisha plated the eggs, simple and perfect, and they sat at the massive dining table that suddenly felt less like a boardroom and more like a place where two people might actually share a meal. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed warmer now, less harsh. "This is nice," Vincent said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he'd forgotten that simple pleasures existed. "It's just eggs." "No, it's not." He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "It's someone caring enough to make sure I eat. It's conversation that doesn't have an agenda. It's—" He paused, searching for words. "It's what I forgot I was missing. Vincent, can I ask you something? After last night, I think you've earned the right to ask me anything. Why did you really hire me? Not the desperate candidate line, the real reason." He set down his fork, considering. "Because when you stood up to me, you reminded me of her. Of Kat. She never let me get away with being less than I could be, even when being better was inconvenient." He met her eyes. "And because, for just a moment, you made me remember what it felt like to be seen as human instead of just powerful. You are human, Vincent. Hurt and angry and afraid, but human. I haven't felt human in a long time. Maybe that's because you haven't let anyone close enough to remind you." They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who've stopped performing for each other. When Keisha rose to clear the dishes, Vincent caught her hand gently. "Let me," he said. "It's been 3 years since I've washed dishes. I think I'd like to remember how." As he stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up and hands deep in soapy water, Keisha saw glimpses of who he might have been before grief and fear hardened him into someone unrecognizable. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if the simple act of cleaning up after a shared meal was a kind of meditation. "Keisha," he said without turning around, Would you consider staying? Not just for the job, but staying?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither had expected when she'd walked into his penthouse yesterday morning. She studied his profile, the vulnerability in the set of his shoulders, the hope he was trying so hard to hide. "What are you asking me exactly?" "I don't know." He laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time. "I haven't thought past wanting you to stay. I haven't wanted anything in so long that I'm not sure I remember how to want things properly. Vincent, I know it's crazy. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been cruel and impossible and everything you should run from." He turned to face her, water dripping from his hands. "But being with you, talking to you, it makes me remember who I used to be. And for the first time in 3 years, I want to try to be that person again." The honesty in his voice was devastating. Here was a man who'd forgotten how to hope, asking someone he'd met 24 hours ago to help him remember how to live. It should have been too much, too fast, too impossible. But as Keisha looked at him, really looked at him, she saw something that made her breath catch. She saw the same lost expression she'd seen in her own mirror after her grandmother died, the same desperate hope that someone somewhere might choose to stay when staying was difficult. "I can't fix you," she said gently. "I can't bring Kat back or take away your grief or cure your illness. I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to stay, while I figure out how to fix myself." And in that moment, Keisha realized that maybe healing wasn't about being fixed by someone else. Maybe it was about finding someone brave enough to sit with you in the broken places until you gathered the courage to mend yourself. "Okay," she said simply. "I'll stay." The relief that washed over Vincent's face was so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely at peace. Really. Outside, the city hummed with its usual urgency, but inside the penthouse, time seemed to slow down. They had found something neither had been looking for, a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the possibility of love, the first green shoot of something that might grow into something beautiful given time and care and courage. The destruction came not with malice, but with the casual cruelty of perfect timing. Vincent's sister arrived unannounced at 2 p.m., her key turning in the lock with the confidence of someone who'd never needed permission to enter. Margaret Ashford Clark swept into the penthouse like a force of nature, her designer heels clicking against the marble with the sharp precision of a woman accustomed to being heard. "Vincent, darling, I've been calling for days." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Keisha organizing medical supplies at the dining table, her expression shifting from concern to something harder to read. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." The word company carried weight, implications that made Keisha's skin prickle with familiar recognition. She'd heard that tone before, in hospital corridors and family meetings where her professional opinion was suddenly questioned not for its merit, but for the color of her skin. "Margaret." Vincent's voice was carefully neutral, but Keisha could see tension coiling in his shoulders. "This is Keisha Washington, my nurse." "Keisha, my sister Margaret." "Nurse." Margaret's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "How refreshing. I didn't know you were accepting applications from—" She paused delicately. "Less conventional candidates." The insult was wrapped in silk, delivered with the kind of practiced sophistication that made it almost impossible to call out without seeming oversensitive. But Keisha had spent enough time in rooms where she was the only person who looked like her to recognize condescension dressed as politeness. "I'm a licensed RN with specialized training in chronic illness management," Keisha said evenly. "I'm sure Vincent can speak to my qualifications." "Oh, I'm sure your qualifications are adequate." Margaret moved deeper into the room, her gaze cataloging everything. The breakfast dishes still in the sink, the comfortable arrangement of furniture that suggested someone had been living here rather than just working. "Vincent, might I have a word?" "Privately. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Keisha." "Really?" Margaret's eyebrows arched with theatrical surprise. "How wonderfully democratic of you." "Very well." She turned back to Keisha with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sure you understand that family matters can be delicate, especially when they involve questions of financial management." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Keisha felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized where this conversation was heading. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," she said carefully. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply noting that it's remarkable how quickly some people become essential to wealthy patients, especially patients who might be vulnerable due to illness or grief." Margaret's voice was honeyed poison. "I've seen it before, of course. Caregivers who position themselves as indispensable, who take advantage of their patients' isolation to secure their own futures." "Margaret, that's enough." Vincent's voice cracked like a whip, but his sister was just getting started. "Is it, though? Because I've done some research on Miss Washington here." She produced a tablet with the flourish of a magician pulling rabbits from hats. "Interesting financial situation. Multiple jobs, mounting debts, facing eviction. Rather desperate circumstances, wouldn't you say?" Keisha felt the blood drain from her face. Every private shame, every struggle she'd tried to hide, laid bare like evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was on trial for. And then, miraculously, she lands a position with one of the wealthiest men in the city. A man who's been notably difficult with previous caregivers, yet somehow she's managed to, what's the phrase, capture his attention. "Stop." Vincent's voice was dangerous now, but Margaret pressed on. "I'm just protecting your interests, darling. You've been through so much since Catherine died, and grief can make people vulnerable to manipulation, especially when the manipulation comes wrapped in such an appealing package." The words hit Keisha like physical blows. Every kindness she'd shown, every moment of genuine connection, reframed as calculation. Every conversation they'd shared painted as a con game where she was the grifter and Vincent the mark. "You think I'm using him," Keisha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you're a smart woman in a desperate situation who recognized an opportunity when she saw one." Margaret's smile was triumphant. "There's no shame in survival, dear. But let's not pretend this is anything more than what it is." Vincent stood abruptly, his face pale with fury. "Get out." "Vincent." "I said get out. Now." "Fine." But when this ends badly, and it will end badly, don't say I didn't warn you." Margaret gathered her purse with theatrical dignity. "She's not Catherine, Vincent, no matter how much you want her to be." The door slammed behind her with finality that seemed to echo through the penthouse like a gunshot. In the silence that followed, Keisha felt the walls of her new world crumbling around her. "Keisha," Vincent started, but she was already backing away. "Is that what you think this is?" Her voice cracked on the words. "Some kind of con? Some desperate woman taking advantage of a lonely man?" "Of course not. Margaret is. She's your sister. She knows you better than I do." Keisha's hands were shaking as she began gathering her things. "And maybe she's right. Maybe I did see an opportunity. Maybe I did let myself get too close because I needed this job so badly. You know that's not true. Do I?" She turned to face him, tears burning in her eyes. "How do I know what's real anymore? How do I know if what I feel is genuine or just gratitude? How do I know if you care about me or if I'm just a replacement for what you lost? Because I know the difference between love and loneliness. Because I know the difference between you and Catherine. Because what, Vincent? Because you've known me for 2 days? Because you suddenly trust your judgment about people when 3 years ago you couldn't even trust yourself to keep living." The words hung between them like a chasm neither could cross. Vincent looked stricken, as if she'd reached into his chest and torn out everything he'd just begun to believe about healing and hope. "I thought," he started, then stopped. "I thought we had something real. Maybe we did. But maybe your sister is right. Maybe I'm just a desperate woman who let herself believe in fairy tales because the alternative was too painful to face." She headed for the door, her heart breaking with every step. "I'll send the agency a replacement. Someone more conventional. Keisha, please. Goodbye, Vincent." The door closed behind her with the soft click of something precious breaking forever. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and finally let the tears come, mourning not just the job she was losing, but the possibility of love she'd been foolish enough to believe in. Behind the door, Vincent sank into his chair and stared at the breakfast dishes they'd shared that morning. Evidence of a connection that felt more real than anything he'd experienced since Catherine died, now twisted into something ugly by suspicion and fear. Vincent spent the next 18 hours learning the difference between solitude and loneliness. The penthouse felt cavernous without Keisha's presence, every room echoing with the ghost of conversations that had made him remember what it felt like to be human. He'd hired 3 different replacement nurses through the agency, but each one lasted less than 4 hours before his barely contained rage sent them fleeing. Not because he was cruel to them, he barely spoke to them at all, but because their professional competence only highlighted what he'd lost. None of them made coffee the way Keisha did, strong enough to chase away the morning fog but not bitter. None of them understood that his silence wasn't rejection but processing. None of them looked at him like he was a person worth saving instead of a problem to be managed. By midnight, he was alone again, staring at the medical equipment that had become his prison. His medication schedule lay forgotten on the counter, his meals untouched. For the first time since Catherine's death, he found himself not caring whether he lived or died. Not from depression, but from the devastating realization that he'd found something worth living for and thrown it away. Margaret called 6 times. He didn't answer. His lawyers called about the Hendricks acquisition. He let it go to voicemail. The only call he returned was to his private investigator, and what he learned made him sick with shame. Keisha Washington had indeed been facing eviction. She had indeed been struggling with mounting medical bills from her grandmother's final months of care. She had indeed taken the job out of desperation. But she'd also turned down 3 easier, better-paying positions to stay with a dying woman who wasn't even related to her, working doubles at the clinic to pay for pain medication that insurance wouldn't cover. She'd sold her grandmother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing she owned, to pay for a funeral that gave Dorothy Washington the dignity she deserved. Everything Margaret had said was technically true and fundamentally wrong. Vincent found himself in his study at 3 a.m., staring at a framed photo of Catherine that he'd hidden in a drawer 2 years ago because looking at it hurt too much. Her smile seemed to mock him from behind the glass. "What would you do?" he asked her image. "If someone you loved was afraid to trust their own heart because the world had taught them that people like them don't get fairy tale endings?" Catherine's voice came back to him across the years, something she'd said during one of their last conversations. "The bravest thing you can do isn't loving someone despite the risk. It's showing someone they're worth the risk of loving." He'd failed at that. When Keisha had been most vulnerable, when Margaret's poisonous words had awakened every doubt and insecurity she'd ever carried, he'd let her walk away instead of fighting for what they'd found together. At 4 a.m., he made a decision that would have been impossible before Keisha had reminded him what courage looked like. Keisha was in her kitchen, making coffee she couldn't afford while staring at a past due notice she couldn't pay, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. Desperate people couldn't be picky about phone calls. "Miss Washington? This is Dr. Patricia Chun from Mount Sinai. I understand you've been working privately with Vincent Ashford." Keisha's stomach clenched. "Is he all right?" "That's what I'm calling about. He's asked me to verify something for you. About his prognosis." "I don't understand." "Mr. Ashford has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed 8 months ago, shortly after the 3rd anniversary of his wife's death. His doctors gave him 6 months to live. He's now 2 months past that expiration date." The words hit Keisha like a physical blow. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The medical supplies she'd organized, the careful medication schedule, the way he held himself like someone carrying a devastating secret. It all made terrible sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he wanted you to know that when he hired you, he wasn't looking for a long-term caregiver. He was looking for someone to help him die with dignity. He says you did something more important. You helped him remember how to live." Keisha sank into a chair, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Dr. Chun, is he?" "He's declining rapidly. The stress of the past few days has accelerated the progression. He's asking for you, Miss Washington. But I want you to understand, if you choose to see him, you'll be saying goodbye." After she hung up, Keisha sat in her empty apartment and faced the hardest choice of her life. She could protect herself, maintain the safe distance that would keep her heart intact when the inevitable happened. Or she could choose love, knowing it would end in loss. Her grandmother's voice came back to her. "Baby girl, the measure of a life isn't how long you live. It's how brave you are with the time you're given." Vincent had been brave enough to open his heart when he'd thought he had nothing left to lose. The least she could do was be brave enough to open hers when she knew exactly what it would cost. She was at his door by 6 a.m., her key still working because he'd never asked for it back. The penthouse was dark, silent, and when she found him in his bedroom, she understood immediately that Dr. Chen's call had been more urgent than she'd realized. Vincent lay propped against his pillows, his skin gray and his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear when they met hers. "You came," he whispered. "I came. Keisha, I need you to know." "I know. Dr. Chen told me. About the cancer, about the prognosis, about everything." He closed his eyes, relief washing over his features. "I should have told you myself." "You should have. But I understand why you didn't." "Do you?" She moved closer, taking his hand in hers. It was thinner than it had been 3 days ago, but it was still warm, still unmistakably his. "You were protecting me. From the pain of losing someone else I cared about. I was protecting myself too. From having to watch someone I love walk away when things got difficult." The word love hung between them, finally spoken, finally true. It should have been too late for love, but somehow it felt like perfect timing. 6 months later, Keisha Washington stood in the garden of the Vincent Ashford Children's Medical Center, watching children play on equipment that had been designed with joy in mind rather than institutional efficiency. The autumn air carried the scent of the roses Vincent had insisted on planting. Catherine's favorite variety, he'd told her, the ones that bloomed twice each year and filled the air with hope. The doctors had been wrong about the timeline, but not about the outcome. Vincent had lived 5 months longer than anyone had expected. long enough to see his plans for the medical center come to fruition, long enough to establish the Dorothy May Washington Nursing Scholarship Fund, long enough to marry Keisha in a small ceremony in the penthouse garden with Margaret tearfully serving as maid of honor after begging forgiveness for her cruelty. Long enough to prove that love measured in days could be deeper than love measured in decades. Mrs. Ashford? A young voice interrupted her thoughts. Maria Santos, the 7-year-old daughter of one of the center's janitors, tugged on Keisha's white coat with the persistence of a child who'd never been taught that some people were too important to bother. "What is it, sweetheart? Mama says you're the lady who made this place happen. Is that true?" Keisha knelt to Maria's level, smoothing down the little girl's dark hair. "Not just me. A very special man had the idea first. I just helped make sure it happened the way he wanted. The man who loved you. Yes, the man who loved me. Mama says when people love each other, they make beautiful things together. Like me and my baby brother." Maria's gap-toothed grin was infectious. "Did you and the man make something beautiful?" Keisha's eyes swept across the medical center, state-of-the-art equipment housed in buildings designed to feel like home rather than hospital, gardens where families could find peace during difficult times, playrooms where sick children could still be children. All of it funded by Vincent's estate, all of it bearing his and Catherine's names, all of it a testament to the belief that healing required more than medicine. "Yes," she said softly. "We made something very beautiful." Maria nodded with the satisfied wisdom of a child whose questions had been answered properly, then skipped back toward the playground where her mother was watching with the careful attention of someone who understood that ordinary moments were actually miracles in disguise. Keisha rose and continued her walk through the garden, past the memorial bench where Vincent's and Catherine's names were engraved together, past the fountain where coins thrown by hopeful families caught the afternoon sunlight. She'd come here every day since the center opened, not from obligation but from joy. This was where Vincent's vision lived on, where his belief in second chances and unexpected love took concrete form. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Board meeting went beautifully. The expansion plans are approved. Vincent would be so proud." Margaret had surprised everyone by throwing herself into the medical center's operation with the same fierce devotion she'd once reserved for protecting her brother from imaginary threats. She'd apologized to Keisha so many times that Keisha had finally banned the word sorry from their conversations, insisting that action mattered more than words. "He is proud," Keisha texted back. "I can feel it." And she could. Not in any mystical sense, but in the way love echoes through the choices of those left behind. Every child who received care at the center, every family who found hope in its halls, every nurse who received a scholarship to pursue their calling. All of it was Vincent's love made manifest, his final gift to a world that had taught him cruelty but received his compassion in return. As she reached the center's main entrance, Keisha paused beside the bronze plaque that bore Vincent's words, dictated to her during one of his last lucid days. "In memory of all the love we're brave enough to give, and in honor of all the love we're wise enough to receive." "Keisha," a familiar voice called across the garden. Dr. Patricia Chun approached with the quick step of someone perpetually busy, but never too busy for what mattered. "I was hoping I'd find you here." "Dr. Chun, how did the surgery go?" "Perfectly. Little Timothy will be home for Christmas." Patricia's smile was radiant. "His parents asked me to thank you specifically. The family care suite made all the difference during his recovery." The family care suites had been Vincent's idea. Comfortable spaces where parents could stay close to their children without sleeping in hospital chairs. He'd remembered too well what it felt like to be helpless in the face of a loved one's illness, how institutional spaces could steal dignity along with hope. "Any word on the research grant?" Keisha asked. "Approved. Full funding for 3 years." Patricia paused, studying Keisha's face. "He'd be amazed, you know. Vincent always said you were the strongest person he'd ever met, but I don't think even he anticipated how you'd carry his legacy forward." "It's our legacy," Keisha corrected gently. "His vision, my determination, Catherine's compassion. We're all part of it. Have you thought about my offer? The position would be perfect for you, Director of Family Services, overseeing all the programs Vincent envisioned. Keisha had been considering Patricia's offer for weeks. It would mean leaving her position at the community clinic, taking on responsibilities she'd never imagined when she'd first walked into Vincent's penthouse desperate for any job that would pay her rent. "I'll do it," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. "But I want to keep working with families facing terminal diagnoses." That's where Vincent and I met, in that space between hope and loss. I want to make sure no one has to navigate it alone. Patricia's handshake was firm, sealing a partnership that would touch hundreds of lives. As she walked away, Keisha found herself alone in the garden as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the last text Vincent had sent her, just days before he died. "Thank you for showing me that the best day of your life can happen even when you think your life is ending. Thank you for proving that love doesn't require time, it just requires courage." Standing in the garden they'd planned together, surrounded by the laughter of children and the quiet conversations of families finding their way through crisis, Keisha understood finally what Vincent had tried to tell her. The best day of her life hadn't been the day she'd found love. It was the day she'd chosen to keep loving, even knowing it would end. It was the day she'd decided that a heart broken open was still a heart capable of healing others. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Keisha whispered to the evening air, "Thank you, Vincent, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for teaching me that sometimes the job nobody wants becomes the life everybody dreams of." A gentle breeze stirred the roses, carrying their perfume across the garden like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed with the pure joy of someone who'd been given a second chance at childhood, and Keisha smiled, knowing that love, real love, never truly ends. It just finds new ways to bloom. What moments in your own life have taught you that love isn't measured by duration, but by the depth of transformation it creates in both the giver and receiver?